part 2 of the Sunriver U and Owner Enrichment Committee's presentation of the history of Sunriver, presented by John Salzer. My name is Nathan Moses, the Assistant Director of University Events and Community Engagement for OSU Cascades. We had a tremendously successful showing for the first part of our series the other night. I think we've about 250 views at this point, so really good success. And tonight, John is going to bring you the next phase of our adventures through the history of Sunriver. But before we get to that, let's run through a couple upcoming events for you to be aware of. So up there on the screen right now, you've got some of the events from the Sunriver U and Owner Enrichment Committee presentations. First up, History of Sunriver Part 3. We hope you join us in 2 weeks on Thursday, April 8th at 6 p.m. On this YouTube channel again for John's last part of the series. Next up after that, Backyard Birds of Sunriver by Tom Lawler will occur Wednesday, April 14th at 4 p.m. This will actually be in person at the Shark. So that's kind of exciting, kind of get back to a little bit of normalcy. Next up is Defensible Space. Patty Gentiluomo, sorry for butchering that. She's the Director of Natural Resources Department at SROA. This will be on Thursday, April 15th at 4 p.m. This is going to be around how you go about creating defensible space around your home to reduce the effects of a possible forest fire. So great for all of our Sunriver owners. Definitely important information as we start getting into the summer seasons. This will be presented via Zoom. And finally, TED Talks. There's going to be streaming of 2 different videos and a community discussion happening on April 19th at 2:30 p.m. This will also be presented on Zoom. And those of you that are not aware, all these classes are listed on the Sunriver U website. And again, that is sunriveryou.com, where you can get more information about the classes and registration information. Registration is required for each of these upcoming classes, but these are free to the community. So pretty amazing opportunity. Make sure you check that out. Next up, those of you that are new to us, we use the Mentimeter application to go through and do our question and answer period at the end of John's presentation. So tonight's event code is going to be 91555749. You'll see it on the screen right there. Take a snapshot of that QR code to go automatically to the link, or use the Menti app on your mobile devices. The other piece is too, we will be taking questions in the YouTube comment section. So if you don't want to use the Mentimeter app, but you want to make sure you get a question to John, feel free to use the chat function in YouTube. I will say one little addition tonight that we're going to do. In case we do not get to your question, if you are using Mentimeter, go ahead and put your email address in there, and we will make sure that John will get back to you with a question or with an answer to your question. But make sure you put that email address in there. Otherwise, I do not know who it's coming from. So we'll give that a shot tonight. And hopefully, John, we can just get through all the questions. But with so many people attending, we will probably have a lot of questions like we had last time. So, all right. Well, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and reintroduce John in case those of you have not met this wonderful man here, giving a lot of his time and devotion to the history of an area that he absolutely loves. John is a 1966 graduate of OSU. Go Beavs, and later attended Stanford, where he received his MBA before working in the telecommunications industry for 35 years. In 2001, John helped establish the OSU Cascades Foundation and served as its chairperson for 6 years. He's also been active in various nonprofits, including serving as Sunriver's United Way campaign chair for 19 years, helping to spearhead Sunriver's Shark Project, and establishing the Sunriver Service District to provide oversight to police and fire departments. So again, a big virtual round of applause to John, but let's welcome John back, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Nathan. Nice introduction. I appreciate that. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. This project has been a wonderful journey for me, as you could probably tell for those of you who attended the first session. Thank you for joining me today for the second in a series of presentations dealing with the history of Sunriver. Hopefully, those of you who participated in our first session 2 weeks ago came away having learned something new, and also came away with a greater appreciation of the challenges that the McCallums and the Grays faced after they purchased what would become Sunriver in 1964. In addition, I tried to share with the audience the amazing job that was done by the 2 couples and Robert Royston, the landscape architect that they hired, in spending 3 full years designing the plan of Sunriver. They not only created a vision, but started to bring it to life by the time I first visited Sunriver in the summer of 1969. Next slide. The nice thing about participating with OSU Cascades and making these presentations is that we can utilize the latest technology, allowing us to record these presentations so that others will be able to view the classes in the future at their leisure on YouTube. Next slide. So our first class started with the eruption of the lava butte some 7,000 years ago and ended with the opening of the development in 1969. Today, we'll go as far as we can, and then in our next program in 2 weeks, we will go and do the remainder of our history. Then I am hopeful that Sunriver U will allow me to conduct a class or two devoted to the histories of the Village Mall and Shark, both of which have fascinating stories in their own right. So if you'd like to hear these stories, let the folks at the Sunriver U know that you'd like to hear them. Next slide. I shared with you in the last class how all but one of these had obviously been accomplished when I first visited in 1969. What I didn't see was the 11th major accomplishment, which was start planning for a large amphitheater seating 2,500 to 5,000 people. The owners announced that they plan to build the amphitheater to seat this capacity in 3 to 5 years. Interestingly, they plan to build it along Beaver Drive, which coincidentally is where Shark is currently located with its amphitheater. So far, though, I haven't determined why they didn't build it. Next slide. What I couldn't see when I first visited was all of this infrastructure that had been accomplished. Just going through it, 3 water wells, 5,000 gallon water storage reservoir, 63,000 feet of water pipe, 25,000 feet of underground power lines, 38,000 feet of natural gas lines, and 43,000 feet of underground telephone cable. That had all been completed, which I was not even aware of. Next slide. So in putting this program together, I've been constantly reminded of how truly amazing the founding fathers were in their thinking. Think about it. They spent 3 full years planning what Sunriver would be like before they dug their first shovel hole of dirt. Then once they began, they immediately accomplished so much in just 17 months before they opened, and did so always adhering to their basic beliefs. As Don McCallum stated at the time, next slide, I think Don McCallum summarized the essence of the plan and how they plan to implement it. His statement was essentially, this plan means that land use at Sunriver will be managed in such a way as to preserve the natural beauty and keep the air, land, and waterways fresh and unspoiled. I think if you look at that, I think we as the inheritance of this plan have done a pretty good job of adhering to this vision. Next slide. Before going forward, I want to comment on one point. One of the false impressions that new residents and some long-term residents also have is that the original guidelines in the plan of Sunriver were set in stone and would never be modified. This is just not true. One idea included in the original plan of Sunriver that was overturned was a mandatory use of wood shingles. This changed to where we are now prohibited from using wood shingles due to the high risk of fire danger. We also are now able to have asphalt driveways and lawns, which were not allowed initially. Interestingly, we owners are currently getting to vote on a measure this summer to change and update the design manual. Next slide. So let's move ahead in our history lesson. Today's presentation may appear to be disjointed at times, and it may appear that I jump around a bit. But when I designed the presentation, I tried to improve the flow or keep the flow going, but following the calendar. And I wanted to highlight what occurred during a specific year. So it isn't always a smooth transition, and I apologize for that in advance. So I want to start with 1970 and mention that Don and Mary McCallum decided to move permanently to Sunriver that year so that Don could serve as the head of development. They also had a desire to retire and live in Sunriver permanently. So John Gray agreed to buy them out over the next 3 years. Okay, so let's get started with 1970. Next slide. Interestingly, one of the highlights of 1970 was Sunriver's first, and so far, only major fire in Sunriver. According to current fire chief Tim Moore, who I mentioned earlier last session, was working construction at the time, the fire started when someone dumped warm charcoal briquettes in a green plastic garbage can when they checked out. How do I know that the garbage cans were green? Because the fire department decided to get rid of all of the remaining green plastic garbage cans, and Tim got one, and he still has it in his garage. Anyway, the fire quickly spread to all 8 condo units. Charcoal briquettes were soon banned in Sunriver and still aren't allowed. Next slide. How did they put the fire out? They used this antiquated 1,000-gallon fire truck, which had been located and purchased in San Francisco in 1968. They brought it to Sunriver. Next slide. As you can see, having a cedar roof didn't help any. Next slide. The 8 condo units were valued at $350,000 or about $44,000 each. Next slide. The firemen did their best, but it was a lost cause. Next slide. Here are several pictures of what the condos looked like the next day. Next slide. Another picture taken the next day shows that the roof was pretty well destroyed, and so was all the fronts of the units. Next slide. You can't tell from this picture, but the ponderosa tree actually survived. Next slide. As you can see, everything was pretty much destroyed, but the units were rebuilt within the following year. Next slide. Amazingly, the fire was put out by Sunriver employees, who are also volunteer firemen. Next slide. One volunteer fireman suffered minor injuries. Next slide. Shortly thereafter, this 1945 American LaFrance pumper was found and brought to Sunriver. Having 2 fire trucks made Sunriver now eligible to get outside assistance should another fire happen. Next slide. But that's not all that happened in 1970. The folks in Sunriver found another use for the airport property. Let's play polo. How many of you knew that Sunriver formed a polo club made up of players from throughout Central Oregon? Here is an invitation to join the club. Next slide. Round robin tournaments were held on weekends beginning in 1970. Sunriver was a favorite site for these tournaments because we had a green turf where most fields were bare dirt, creating dust clouds for riders and spectators alike. Here is a short video showing our polo grounds. Show the video. Most of the spectators didn't have a clue how polo was played. So the Polo Club created their own pamphlet. Next slide. I have an original pamphlet should any of you in the audience be interested in learning more about the sport. Next slide. The community hosted weekend tournaments against teams from Washington, California, Wyoming, and even as far as Victoria and Calgary, Canada. These teams all made up the Pacific Northwest Polo Circuit clubs. Next slide. The games, of course, were played on, next slide, on the green fields next to the airport runway. Next slide. For 4 years, the matches were the highlight of the summer social season here in Sunriver, with folks dressing up, bringing elaborate picnic baskets and wine. Next slide. And a fancy buffet after the match. The cost of the buffet, as you can see here from the menu, was $7.50. Pretty pricey back then, but the admission to the matches were free. Next slide. Patricio Honey, who is circled in red here on the left, commuted from Mexico City to Sunriver to play with the Sunriver team. He even donated the Mexican Polo Cup he had won in Mexico to the Sunriver International Tournament every year. Next slide. Polo was widely popular and a focal point of the community every summer. So what happened to polo in Sunriver? Well, you will hear about that, what happened shortly. Next slide. So by the following year, 1971, Sunriver had 190 employees and 106 permanent residents. Next slide. Here's something else that occurred back in 1971 that many of you and many of us aren't aware of. How many of you remember the 1951 film titled The African Queen, starring Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn? Both won Academy Awards as Best Actor and Best Actress. No, the film wasn't filmed in Sunriver, nor was it filmed on the Deschutes River. Next slide. Better yet, the tugboat used in the film scene here was called the African Queen, and it was purchased in 1971 by Hal Bailey, a part-time Sunriver resident who had a bike rental business here in Sunriver and was from Eugene. He moved the boat to Sunriver Marina, initially renamed it the Louisville Belle, and then the Sunriver Queen. Finally, he got it in good enough working order to take passengers up and down the Deschutes River, making itself known by blowing its raucous steam whistle. Several of my friends and neighbors were skeptical that this really happened in Sunriver, so I located the following short video showing it here in Sunriver. Show the video, please. Amazing, the fact that the African Queen was plowing the Deschutes River even made the New York Times, as you can see from this page. But after several state and local agencies threatened him, Bailey moved the boat to Florida, never to be found again. Next slide. One of the first nationally recognized individuals to acknowledge what Gray and McCallum were trying to accomplish in Sunriver and developing Sunriver was Charles Kuralt, who you old timers may recall as one of the first contributors to CBS's Sunday morning program. Next slide. Kuralt also visited Sunriver for his On the Road television segment, which was shown on CBS on October 11th, 1971. We actually located the video, but we would have to pay to have it, to be able to get it. So we opted not to, but I do have the verbal, what he said on his show. So Kuralt made the following statement on Sunriver. Next slide. To find a developer who really does believe what's good for the deer and for the owls and for the grass and for the river is also good for people is an overwhelming surprise. But that's what we found at Sunriver, Oregon. Next slide. He went on to say, if you have seen much real estate development in this country, you can imagine what most developers would have done by now. They'd have bulldozed the riverbanks, paved the meadows, sold their houses, and skedaddled. Sunriver's land was luckier than that. Next slide. That wasn't the only positive publicity Sunriver received that year. The first major national magazine exposure for Sunriver came in January 1971 when American Home magazine highlighted Sunriver in their monthly magazine. While the magazine has disappeared, it had a circulation of almost 2 million at the time. Next slide. I have a copy of this magazine should anybody want to see it. The 8-page article had headlines reading, "The healthiest new town in America." Next slide. And "Pollution-free paradise and a place enhanced by man." This publicity, as you can imagine, brought many, many visitors to Sunriver who came to check us out. Next slide. By the following year, 1972, Sunriver had 158 permanent residents. The Sunriver Center was renamed the Great Hall and was to become the community center for homeowners. But it became much too valuable as an asset for the resort for selling to new owners that idea was quickly abandoned. Next slide. Sunriver was in a building boom. 12 individual houses had been built, ranging in cost from $30,000 to $100,000. $100,000 being John Gray's house. 234 individual home sites had been sold. $13 million had been spent by the developers on the area. And next slide. Murray Carson, who was at that time director of sales and marketing, made this famous or infamous statement. He declared without batting an eye that within 15 to 20 years, which would have been 1992, he expected Sunriver to be as large as Bend, which at that time was about 15,000. Not sure what happened. Next slide. Also around this time, Sunriver became large enough that it created its own organizations. One interesting aspect of the Sunriver culture is that many, if not most, organizations which have been formed over the years are still in existence. For example, the Women's Club was formed in 1972. That's almost 60 years ago. The Sunriver Women's Club has been partnering with local nonprofits or organizations in South Deschutes County for more than 20 years, raising over $700,000 for programs that serve women, children, families, and/or seniors. As you can see, the mission statement is to engage in philanthropic endeavors while providing social and community enrichment to our members and our neighbors. Next slide. The organization is as strong as ever, 49 years after it was founded. About 10 years ago, the Women's Club decided to hold a juried art fair with 70 participants. It was an immediate success. This year's event is scheduled to be held in August and will be a virtual one, and you will be able to view and purchase products online. So it's going to be held in August. Next slide. Another group that started in 1972 was the Sunriver Potluck. Until the pandemic arrived last year, 9 months every year since 1972, area residents of the Sunriver community met for 9 potlucks a year. It is still a great way to meet new neighbors. Next slide. little bit of trivia is in order here. Entertainment has always been a big part of our history. Glenn Yarborough appeared in the Great Hall in 1972. Among his other hits, he is the singer of Baby, the Rain Must Fall. Again, you have to be older to know who he is. Next slide. Tickets were $3. I found it interesting that it cost more to go to the buffet, $4, before the concert than it cost to go to the concert itself. Next slide. 1973. Heading into 1973, things were definitely looking up. We were growing very fast with 270 permanent residents. 600 private homes and condos had been built. Lots that once sold for $7,000 or $8,000 were now selling for $20,000 and more. A national magazine stated, praise for Sunriver has been virtually unanimous throughout the nation. Even hardcore environmentalists who appear opposed to any and all housing developments speaks well of Sunriver. Next slide. The initial publication was called the Herald. This is an internal publication. The Sunriver Sun then came into existence in 1973 and was the community's primary means of internal communication until it was replaced by the Sunriver Scene. Next slide. The New Christie Minstrels, one of the top singing groups of the 1970s, having sung Green Green, This Land Is Your Land, and Chim Chim Tree, also appeared in the Great Hall. Next slide. They came and sang in 1973. Next slide. More positive news on the national front. Apartment Construction News, a national trade publication, in their September issue stated, Sunriver is one of the nation's largest second home developments with a remarkable building and sales record because of the close adherence to environmental protection for the wilderness. Next slide. Land Investment USA, a guidebook on property investment, stated, they highlighted Sunriver as an example of the ideal leisure property opportunity. The authors warn against purchasing on their first visit to a property site, then cite that Sunriver is an outstanding exception to this rule. Next slide. The developer was doing everything in their power to attract new customers. This showed that anybody could afford to buy in Sunriver. Next slide. You could even come and stay for as little as $87 for 3 nights in a condo, or $97 if you wanted a 4-bedroom home. Pretty reasonable. Next slide. Based on publicity like this, Sunriver, a way of life, one would be led to believe that everything was coming up roses and the future was truly bright in Sunriver. But those of you who are old enough to remember those days may recall what was beginning to happen. First, there was a Middle East oil embargo, which created a severe gas shortage. Folks couldn't buy gas, and if they could, they often waited in lines to get it. So no one really wanted to travel anywhere away from home for fear they couldn't get back home. If this wasn't enough, John Gray had just spent the past 3 years buying out his partner, the McClellums, and was now the sole owner of Sunriver Properties. Next slide. In addition, Gray had recently embarked on a major expansion of the Salishan Resort. Add to this, the country was facing a severe recession. Inflation was becoming a real issue. Interest rates on 30-year mortgages were going up and up, eventually peaking at over 17%. If you look at it, in that time frame, it was like 8% Think about what 30-year mortgage today costs. John Gray decided that he had, well, eventually it went up to 17%. So what happened? John Gray decided he had to do something to hedge his bets and began looking to find a partner with deep pockets. Next slide. Sunriver Properties considered 30 potential mergers before finally deciding upon Connecticut Mutual Insurance Company, which became a 50% partner with John Gray in Sunriver Properties. And what did Connecticut Mutual do? First, once they were put in charge, they brought in a subsidiary company named Alpert Management Company to manage Sunriver. This company was led by no other than George Romney. Yes, that's the same George Romney who had just run for president in 1968. You recall he lost out to Richard Nixon. George assured everyone that while we were in the midst of a recession, the development of Sunriver would continue at its current pace, and the fulfillment of the environmental objectives originally set forth in the plan of Sunriver would continue. Sounds good, didn't it? Doesn't it? And it did at the time. Next slide. So George immediately brought in his 33-year-old son, Scott, to be a hatchet man. Scott is the brother of Mitt Romney, the current senator from Utah. Scott stated in this article that appeared in the bulletin shortly after his arrival that he plans no magical acts for Sunriver, but that wasn't true. He magically made many long-term trusted and dedicated employees disappear by firing them. Fortunately, Scott didn't stay long. A good indicator of Scott's character is that he's now an attorney in Michigan and has been married 4 times. Next slide. Besides firing people, he also eliminated the popular polo field by paving it and turning it into a parking lot next to the airport. You can see it encircled there. Next slide. Speaking of the Sunriver Airport, bet you didn't know that Air Oregon had 3 daily flights into and from Sunriver and Portland in the mid-70s. Not sure what became of the idea. Next slide. Even though it sounds like having Connecticut Mutual become a partner was a real downer, Sunriver was still getting great press nationally in 1974. Here, Time magazine, in their October 1st issue, had a cover story on the new American land rush. Sunriver was signaled out as one of the few good guys in the land development business. Next slide. Sunset magazine, in their October issue, cited the new ranch cabin condominiums as winner in their Western Home Awards program that annually spotlighted outstanding examples of Western housing. Next slide. Crow's Forest Industry honored the ranch cabins with a cover design and a feature story in their August issue. So in spite of the purchase by Connecticut Mutual, things were still progressing. Next slide. One requirement of this plan of Sunriver was to create a process by which many of the services, functions, and the operations initially provided by Sunriver Properties would be turned over to the owners. This includes snow removal, police and fire, and enforcement of the design and other rules. So internally, things were moving along fairly normal. So the plan of Sunriver stated that we had to create the formation of an owners association must be done by 1974. So the transition was to be an evolutionary one rather than a signal event that occurs suddenly. The original idea was the transfer would occur when 90% of the land had been sold, or by 1999, whichever came first. So the process started in 1972 with informal meetings between the owners and Sunriver Properties. Next slide. The plan of Sunriver also stated that by the end of 1973, the Articles of Incorporation and the formation of the Sunriver Homeowners Association and the election of officers would be formalized. Next slide. The final transition actually occurred in 1987 when a full-time administrator was hired by the board of directors. Some people ask, how did the various assets get divided up between the developers and homeowners? Some amenities, such as the swimming pools and the various tennis courts, were deeded to Sun SROA to relieve the tax burden on Connecticut Mutual. An exchange agreement worked out the details. The design committee was turned over to SROA in 1980. So even though SRA was formed, Sunriver Properties continued to be the administrator until 1987. They formed it in 1974, but it wasn't until 1987 when SROA assumed full control over its destiny. Next slide. Okay, I'm taking a break. I thought I'd again share with you Sunriver's important role in the movies. John Wayne starred in and won an Oscar for his performance in True Grit, which was filmed in and around Sunriver. Also in the film were three then unknowns: singer Glenn Campbell in his first and probably last acting job, but also Robert Duvall and Dennis Hopper, who would both go on to have successful film careers. Next slide. Then in 1975, John Wayne and Katharine Hepburn actually lived in Sunriver most of the summer while filming Rooster Cogburn, the sequel to True Grit. Next slide. Hepburn lived in a meadow house while Wayne lived in John Gray's house, which is now owned by Kate Mendenhall. Many locals got jobs as extras during the filming of the Rooster Cogburn. Next slide. Okay, by the middle of 1976, the economy was slowly pulling out of its slump. Sunriver was celebrating its 8th birthday. Next slide. Sunriver had one special special one-time sale. All lots were 5% off, and if you purchased a lot and made a deposit by a certain date, after which the lots would go back up to the original price. So we were almost guaranteed a 5% increase. So they were doing, in 1976, they were doing their best to sell off their lots. Next slide. Also in 1976, Sunriver attracted its first pharmacy. Unfortunately, it didn't survive, and we still don't have a pharmacy in the community, even though several others have attempted to get established. Next slide. As I mentioned, once an organization gets established in Sunriver, they don't go away. I mentioned the Women's Club and the potlucks earlier. Another good example is the Sunriver Anglers. This group was officially formed in 1976 and is still active and involved, is an active and involved organization made up of both men and women. Next slide. The group not only holds monthly meetings and organizes outings throughout the region, they also teach newcomers the fine art of fly fishing. Next slide. In addition, the group supports local organizations like the Kokanee Carnival in Bend in their conservation efforts, and even, next slide, raises money that goes to provide scholarships for students at Oregon State University who are getting a degree in fish and wildlife studies. Next slide. But the big thing that occurred in 1976 was the proposed sale of 40% of Sunriver. Next slide. Connecticut Mutual decided in 1976 that they wanted to get out of the land business and announced that they had negotiated the sale of 3,300 acres, or 58% of the original 5,500 acres of Sunriver, back to the Forest Service for a total of $6 million. Next slide. As you can imagine, and you can see from the headlines in this newspaper article, the issue was very contentious and a bitter one. Next slide. Connecticut Mutual argued that the deal was merely intended to limit expansion and to allow the public more access to Forest Service lands. Those in the know knew differently. Connecticut Mutual didn't want to be in the land development business anymore, and this sale would allow them to exit Sunriver sooner. Next page. So what does it amount to? Let me show you. So this is what in red was the boundary of Sunriver at that time. So the red shows the original Sunriver. Here in green is what would be sold to the U.S. Forest Service if the sale went through. You can see Harper's Bridge down at the bottom. Next slide. The part in blue is the land on the other side of the river. Most people don't realize that we had land on both sides of the river back then. And a little known fact is that there were going to be houses built all along the other side of the river, which is shown here in blue, as it meandered through Sunriver. Also not known is that all of the property on the other side of the river was going to be in an automobile free zone. In other words, anybody who owned a house on that side of the river would not be able to access it in an automobile. Next page. So the green land here, shown here, would be the new Sunriver if the sale went through. Another interesting tidbit is that a poll taken of homeowners at the time showed that over 80% supported the idea of the sale. Why do you suppose they felt this way? Well, because most of the old timers liked the idea of keeping the community small. Those opposing the idea feared that a second golf course would not be built. At the time, this second course would have been private and would be for owners only. Next slide. As mentioned before, the issue was very contentious and bitter, and there were numerous articles almost daily in the paper regarding the sale. Next page. So what happened? The deal had to be approved by the 3 Deschutes County commissioners. It turned out that they were in no mood to approve of the sale because they feared the loss of potential property taxes should they allow the sale to go through. Sunriver was, and still is, a financial gold mine for the county. Why is this? Because Sunriver pours in millions into the county's treasury through our property taxes while requiring very little in the way of services in return from the county. Next slide. To support this idea, at the time it was estimated that if the sale went through, the county would receive $24,000 annually in the form of property taxes from the services, the district. But if they did turn down the sale, the county would average about $1.5 million annually in tax revenues. Guess what they did? Obviously, not everyone was in favor of the idea of selling land back to the Forest Service. And you can see here, they had meetings where they gathered together in this article. Next slide. They became a very vocal force to deal with. Next slide. Even the Bulletin entered the battle, saying too much of the negotiations were conducted in secret and without public notice. Next slide. The county commissioners eventually met and unanimously vetoed the sale. They stated their reasons for saying no to the deal was 80% of Deschutes County was already in public ownership. There were 1.5 million acres in Deschutes National Forest, so no need to add 3,187 additional acres from Sunriver. Also, the county would benefit from having the 1.5 million in property taxes yearly that would go away if the sale was approved. They also felt that the $6 million price tag was too high. So what happened next? The Bulletin commended the county commissioners for not approving the sale. Connecticut Mutual was not about to take the defeat lightly. A compromise was quickly drawn up between the resort and U.S. Forest Service. A second proposal was quickly agreed upon between the two parties. The new deal was not for the $6 million, but for $2.8 million. Everyone was pleased with the compromise except for the Bulletin. The deal was held up until October of 1978 as the two sides went back and forth in their negotiations. Again, the Bulletin wasn't pleased with the new deal and was very critical of the Forest Service. The Forest Service took offense to the Bulletin criticism, and they responded back and forth. So what was the end result? In the end, instead of selling 3,187 acres, which is the amount shown here, the new plan called for selling 2,185 acres, which was 40% of the original property, here shown in green. It included keeping the plans for a second golf course, but also created one of the greatest Sunriver mysteries of all time. A quick look at our current Sunriver map shows traffic circles scattered throughout Sunriver and seemingly numbered from 1 to 11. But sooner or later, everyone recognizes or notices that Circle 8 is strangely missing. At the time of the sale, it was deemed too difficult and too confusing to renumber all of the circles. In the original design, the roads and areas it would have served were located within the 2,200 acres that were to be sold to the Forest Service. As a result, Circle 8 was no longer necessary and therefore never built. So now you know the rest of the story. So what else happened in that time frame? In 1977, you may have never heard of this, but in September, Sunriver hosted the Olympic Crawfish Festival. No, I'm not kidding. Much of the crawfish used in these Olympics were caught here in the Deschutes River. People used these nets and traps like the one shown here. Chefs from all over the country traveled to Sunriver to compete in these Olympics. And the winning chef was from New Orleans. So we're up to 1978.
One of the activities that sets Sunriver apart from most other communities is our music festival. Here's how it got its start. A Sunriver couple had friends from California visiting them in 1976. They took the couple on a tour of the Great Hall. As the group toured the historical structure, the friend snapped his fingers and said, pretty good acoustics in here. Then someone else added, wouldn't it be great? A great place for a music festival. 2.5 years later, the festival would launch its first season in 1968. Next slide. 1978, pardon me. Then the first artistic director was Lawrence Larry Layton Smith. He was part of the founding committee developing the fledgling Sunriver Music Festival. Larry worked as the artistic director until after the 1983 season, then returned as artistic director in 1995 and remained in this position until 2012. Next slide. George Hansen was then invited to be guest conductor in 2011 to work with Larry, and was hired in the fall of 2011 and continued in that position through the 2019 season. This year, they are going to be selecting a new artistic director. The festival made a major change in focus in 2010 with Bend concerts. Starting in 2010, half of the festival moved to Bend using the historic Tower Theater and the Bend High School Auditorium for pops and classical concerts. Sunriver had been holding the Pops concert in Bend for years, but that was the only concert in Bend during the early years. An interesting sidelight is that the Sunriver Music Festival office burned down over Labor Day weekend in 2006. It was located in Building 15 in the Village Mall. Fortunately, all of the historic scrapbooks made it through the fire fine. Pretty much everything else was lost. Next slide. One of the unique aspects of the Sunriver Music Festival is that almost all of the musicians are hosted in the homes of Sunriver residents during the concert season. Many have been doing this for 25 or more years. Many musicians bring their families with them and treat their visit as a vacation. Next slide. In addition, for over 25 years, the Music Festival has raised funds for the Young Artist Scholarship Program. During the 25 years in existence, 586,000 has been awarded to classical music students in Central Oregon. In 2020, 24 students recognized here were awarded a total of 35,000. Next slide. The Music Festival's 44th season of the Summer Festival returns this summer, August 14th to 23rd, with all of the concert outside in the open air. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that the new property sale with the Forest Service allowed for a second 18-hole golf course. The North Course was originally going to be called the Mountain Village Course. Then someone realized that there wasn't a mountain on the course, and there wasn't going to be a village on the course either. So the name was quickly changed to the Woodlands Course. Of course, the course is surrounded by woods. Stupid. In the original plan, the main course was going to be an owners only course, while the Meadows course would be mainly for guests. But this plan changed when it was decided that both the Meadows and Woodland courses would stay with Sunriver Properties when the assets were divided up. Next slide. The course was developed by Robert Jones, who is recognized as one of the foremost golf designers of all time. Next slide. He personally supervised much of the project. He described the project as one of the most enjoyable challenges I've had to date. To design a course worthy of the overall character and achievements of Sunriver. Nice compliment. The initial design called for two holes bordering the Deschutes River. That didn't happen. Not sure why. Next slide. According to a very reliable source, Joe Ward, whose article is here, who was in charge of the crew building the course, was a heavy drinker. Evidently, he had been drinking heavily. Actually, I heard that he was drunk as a skunk when he went into the sauna at the Bend Country Club and never got out. As the article indicates, he was found dead 3 hours later. As the article indicates, he died of excessive heat. It was somewhere between 140 and 170 degrees within the sauna. So that's the real reason Robert Trent Jones spent so much time in Sunriver. He had to take over the supervision of the development of the course for Joe Ward. Next slide. 1979. It saw the Sunriver hosting a unique event for the first and only time. I bet you don't know about it. The event was called the Levi Ride and Tie race. I'd never heard of it. Historically, the ride and tie was used as an effective means of travel when you had two people and only one horse, who by necessity needed to travel long distances sharing this one horse. One person would get on the horse and ride while the other ran. The rider of the horse would then tie the horse to a tree and then proceed on foot. By the time the trailing runner reached the horse, the animal was rested and the process would begin all over again. Teams would travel over a cross-country course covering about 30 miles in a day. Next slide. The sport was invented by Levi Strauss and Company in 1971 to promote its rugged outdoor clothing. The endurance event boomed in popularity in the 70s, even attracting famous participants like actor Robert Redford. Here is a design of the course they ran for the championship in Sunriver. It was 30 miles long. More than 200 teams attended the World Championships here in Sunriver that year. Here are where the folks are from, all over the country. Today, the sport itself endures with about 30 teams competing all over the country. Next slide. 1980. Sunriver's focus on the environment was so great that in 1980, the community was the first privately owned community in the country to be recognized as a Tree City USA by the Arbor Day Foundation. Next slide. We still hold that distinction 40 plus years later. Next slide. 1982. The North Store opens for business, as well as and then also in 1982, the limo used by the J.R. Ewing family in the television show Dallas ended up here in Sunriver and was used to transport guests back and forth from the Redmond Airport. This Cadillac Eldorado was built in 1975 and rebuilt in 1978, but it wasn't your usual limo. They actually took two Eldorados, cut the frame in half, and added 13 inches to the wheelbase, all for $32,000. So far, we haven't talked about the important role that the Sunriver Nature Center has played in our history. So I'll go back and forth to give a brief history to show the important events that happened in 1982 when the developers donated 8 acres to the west of Lake Aspen for a new building. They also pledged $10,000 for each of the following 2 years to help raise money. Led by Jay Bowerman, the executive director, enough money was raised to build the new center. This new center opened in 1984. So let me share with you a little history of the Nature Center. Sunriver Nature Center and Observatory was formed in 1972 and was called the Ecologium and then the Nature Study Center. It was located in the same building as the then new Sunriver Laundromat, seen here. The building is where the South Bend Bistro is currently located. They outgrew this building and they ended up moving the Nature Center to the HR building. And this is what it looks like today. Of course, it didn't look like that back in late 1970s, early 80s. Speaking of Jay Bowerman, he is the son of Bill Bowerman, former track coach at the University of Oregon, and along with Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. Jay was also an Olympic biathlon elite in his own right. Next slide. Jay and his wife, Teresa, have been leaders in the Sunriver community ever since they arrived in 1970 and were instrumental in the creation of the Second Turn, whose proceeds support the Nature Center. Next slide. An interesting sidelight is that during my research, I came across this original copy of a typewritten letter that Jay typed to Sunriver seeking a part-time job in 1970. And he was hired, and he replaced Jim Anderson as resident naturalist in 1973. He held the executive director position for 26 years. Next slide. Jay is known worldwide as an expert on the Oregon spotted frog, which was added to the federal endangered species list in 2014. Next slide. Jay has authored more than 20 scientific papers on the amphibian biology based on his Sunriver research. When the frogs migrate from their spawning grounds, they have to travel over our roads and bike paths. And the word gets out that they're migrating, and folks come out and assist the frogs getting across the roads and the bike paths near the Nature Center. Great activity for kids. Back to the Nature Center. In 1990, the observatory was constructed, and a year later, the dome was added and the name was changed to the Sunriver Nature Center and Observatory. Next slide. The mission of the Sunriver Nature Center is to inspire present and future generations to cherish and understand our natural world. Only fitting that it's in Sunriver. 2 years ago, under the leadership of Sunriver resident Marv Henberg, the organization began a $5 million fundraising campaign to upgrade and expand their facilities. They are well on their way to achieving this goal. Moving on, in 1983, the Sunriver Preparatory School was founded. It was an independent school for kindergarten through 12th grade students. The 12-acre property where the Holy Trinity is currently located had been donated by Sunriver Properties. In the first year, 65 students enrolled, and the following year, this number doubled. By 1990, it had 165 students. About 60% of the students traveled from Bend, and the other 40% were here in Sunriver. It wasn't cheap. Tuition was close to $5,000 per year. After about a dozen years, the decision was made to move the school to Bend. In 2003, the decision to close the school was made after 20 years. At the time, the private school, which had 130 students and 19 teachers, had failed to become part of the Bend Lapine School District, so wasn't eligible for state funding. During the 20-year period it operated, every high school graduate went on to a 4-year university. Next slide. One of the other highlights from the year 1984 was the opening of the North Pool. Next slide. By 1986, Sunriver had roughly 800 condos and 1,500 homes. Next slide. By this time, it was meeting one of John Gray's goals, and that was Sunriver was designed to have all the advantages of a city, but without the bureaucracy. Next slide. As you can see, by 1986, Sunriver had pretty much accomplished John Gray's goal. We had a police and fire protection. We had sewer system, underground utility service, own post office and library, 2 gas stations, 2 grocery stores, an abundance of restaurants and shops, a grade school up through 8th grade, and a small and effectively run governing body. A plan called the Exchange Agreement between Sunriver Properties and SROA was created and agreed upon. The purpose was to determine how to divide the assets for when SROA became independent. The proposal was voted upon and rejected by the owners. So this was the initial agreement on your screen. The agreement went through several revisions and was ultimately approved. But the organization had completely outgrown its offices in the mall and something had to be done. Next slide. So on January 1st, 1987, SROA, the homeowners, officially took over management of Sunriver. It was basically a non-event. The plan called for the formation of a transition team in 1974, and this would prove to be very effective. Next slide. As mentioned before, the Homeowners Association headquarters was located in the mall above Goodies from its foundation in 1987 until 2000. In 1991, owners were asked to approve a special assessment not to exceed $30 per month for 36 months to build an admin building. It failed to get the 60% vote. Just mentioned that Sunriver Prep moved to Bend in 2002. The owners were again asked to assess themselves in order to purchase the entire prep school site. The cost, $14.94 per month for 36 months. Needing a 60% favorable vote, it got just a 42% positive vote. Again, in 1998, the owners were asked to approve a one-time assessment of $280 to purchase a part of the Sunriver Prep location. It failed again with just 47% positive vote. You see a trend here. Finally, in July of 1999, the voters were asked to approve the construction of the admin building and police headquarters where it is now, but without a special assessment. Instead, the association was going to use surplus funds, money from the reserve fund, and borrow the rest. Finally, this measure passed with a 75% positive vote, and construction began in 2000. Then in 2001, owners were again asked to vote to borrow money from our reserve funds to pay off the bank loan. This was approved. As of this month, we still owe $170,000 on this loan. I wanted to share this detailed information only because when we talk about shark, we'll be referring back to this issue. Next slide. Here's the building being framed. Roof trusses are installed. Next slide. Roof trusses are installed. Next slide. The sheathing is put on place. Next slide. The roof is put on. Next slide. And the building is pretty well complete. Next slide. The finished product. Next slide. The building was completed and dedicated in 2001. Now let's go to the final issue I want to talk about today that had an important part of our history. First, a history lesson. In 1976, Deschutes County began collecting a 5% room tax on all overnight guests. They, one, deemed it a luxury tax, and two, the people who had to pay it could afford to do so, they believed, and three, it was only fair that guests help pay for the services provided by the county while they were here. Next slide. In most unincorporated communities, which Sunriver is, these funds provide roads, utilities, as well as police, fire, and ambulance services. I think you know where this is headed. In Sunriver, these services aren't provided by the county, but they are paid for by the homeowners through our homeowners dues. Next slide. The rate went up to 6% and then 7% in 1978. Sunriver has always generated more room tax than any city in Oregon outside of Portland. By 1978, the amount collected and turned over to the county from Sunriver was $785,000. A group of homeowners, next slide, homeowners approached the board about looking into incorporating. The board spent considerable time exploring this issue. If we incorporated and became a city, only registered voters in the county would have a say in our government. Absentee owners would be totally left out of the decision-making process. We would also have to annex the Deschutes River Woods or some other area outside of Sunriver in order to comply with state requirements to provide low-income housing. We would lose control over our roads and what the speed limits could be. We would probably have to put in curbs and sidewalks. The board was divided 5-4 against the idea. Next slide. The proponents of the idea of incorporating wouldn't take no for an answer. So by the early 1990s, the vast majority of Deschutes County's lodging tax was coming from Sunriver. The group formed a group called the Sunriver Incorporation Committee, and in January of 1992, approached the Deschutes County Commissioner with a proposal to incorporate. The commissioners didn't want to deal with this, and for good reason, because they didn't know where they would replace the money, room tax money, if Sunriver incorporated. By then, this tax generated $1.2 million. A small portion of the revenue from this fund went to the state of Oregon and was used to promote tourism. For Deschutes County, a small portion of the tax went to COVA, Central Oregon Visitor Association, to promote local tourism, but the vast majority of the revenue went to fund the Deschutes County Sheriff's Department. Sunriver's owners were not only funding our own police department, but were also paying for the county sheriff's department and received little or no benefit from collecting this revenue. If we became a city, these funds would stay in Sunriver and could be used however we wanted to use them. Sounds great, doesn't it? They ruled that the proponent's proposal was insufficient. Next slide. The Sunriver Incorporation group still wouldn't give up. By now, the community was really divided, and friends and neighbors strongly and vocally were on one side of the issue or the other. Friends became enemies and neighbors stopped talking to one another. Finally, in November of 1993, the group convinced the county commissioners to allow the citizens of Sunriver to vote in May on the issue. The vote was taken and the owners overwhelmingly vetoed the idea, resulting in many of the proponents being so upset they moved away en masse. The Mountain High community in South Bend became known as Sunriver North. Even though the rest of the county has seen a big increase in rental properties over time, Sunriver still provides 50% of the county's transient room tax, now called transient room tax. The issue of incorporation continues to be raised periodically. Sunriver's transient room tax has continued to grow and is estimated that $6 million was raised in 2019. Over the years, the county commissioners have recognized that they are the beneficiaries of this windfall revenue. As a result, they moved the COVA, the Central Oregon Visitors Association, operation from the old mill district to Sunriver a few years ago. But the issue of whether or not to incorporate and become a city is still out there. Next slide. Next, so in June, Lowe's Enterprises purchased the resort from Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance and formed Sunriver Resort Limited Partnership, SRLP. They also purchased 600 acres from Connecticut Mutual just south of Sunriver and created Crosswater. So the new partnership began a major capital improvement campaign. In 2006, an additional 614 acres was purchased from the federal government, allowing it for additional growth, that being Caldera. Next slide. So in 1993, Lowe's joined with Pacific Trust and others in purchasing the property from Connecticut Mutual. At the time, Sunriver was valued at $23.6 million. Charlie Peck became the managing director. The new partnership undertook a $45 million overhaul renovation project. Next slide. Under his leadership, the company renovated the lodge and the guest rooms. Next slide. Acquiring the tennis court and creating Sage Springs. Next slide. And also completely rebuilt and renovated the River Lodge condos. Next slide. They also purchased 600 acres from Connecticut Mutual and it became Crosswater, as you can see here. This partnership has been a great asset to our community. For example, they not only paid to build the back roads to Mount Bachelor, but paid to maintain it for years. Next slide. 1994, and I'm going to end here, 1984, but here's a slide I want to show you. No, these aren't aliens from outer space. They are folks from the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality. Many of you remember Sunriver Sledding Hill. It was located where the parking lot for Shark is currently located. It was merely put in place where vacationers would bring their sleds and toboggans and sled. As it turned out, the hill and the adjacent parking area was where the folks responsible for taking Camp Abbott apart brought the debris and dumped it before hauling it off. In other words, it was a staging area. In 1994, it was discovered that a very, very small particles of asbestos were found in the ground. Even though it would take an individual consuming massive amount of these particles before getting sick, there was enough concern that annually a team of hazmat workers dressed like the folks in the picture would come in mass along Beaver Drive looking for minute particles of asbestos. Tune in to our class on Shark to see what ultimately solved this problem. So I think with that, I'll end the program. Turn it back to Nathan.
All right, John, thank you. Just like last time, so many things I didn't know. And True Grit is actually, I think, one of my father-in-law's favorite movies. So I think that was the the thing for me. We're big movie buffs, so learning a little bit more about that was super enjoyable tonight. For everybody that's on right now, this is kind of our time for questions. And looking by some of the viewers right now, it looks like this was definitely kind of a sit back and take everything in because it was a lot of really good information. So let's get some of those questions in. For tonight, again, just as a reminder, we'll throw that Mentimeter slide up one more time, but we do have the option for submitting questions through the Mentimeter app. That is going to be event code 91555-749. And again, that's at the bottom of your screen right there. You could take the picture of a QR code right here, and that will go directly on your mobile device and pull up that website. Or you can use the app if any of you have the app on your phone, or just pop in menti.com in your browser. So we'll kind of get some time here going forward with that, and we'll give everybody some time for to enter some questions in, John. To kind of kick off though, one thing I just kind of want to start off with, I think we did last time too, is for this period of time for preparing for this session, what to you is the most exciting thing or the most interesting thing for some of the history as a resident of Sunriver that you covered for tonight?
Well, I find it fascinating because as word got out that I was actually going to be doing this, people have reached out to me and given me information and material. I am now the collector of all this paraphernalia that people have. They don't know what to do with it. Their parents, their dad was a Camp Abbott participant, whatever it might be. And so I'm now collecting all this stuff. I got to figure out what we're going to do. Interesting enough, the Nature Center has approached me and they want to create some exhibits of our history using some of the material and some of the information I have. So it's been very rewarding from that standpoint. But for me, the thing I find so interesting is and what I've tried to incorporate is I'm hoping that everybody who watches the program will come away with something new they didn't know about before about our history, because it's a fascinating history. And the next session, even though people that's more current, I still have a bunch of stuff that people will find of interest. And I'll just do a tickler, for instance, is that when I talk about the mall and why I want to do a program on the mall, two of the former owners of the mall are currently in jail. And so why are they in jail? I'm going to explain that in the program.
Well, thank you for that. I'm kind of curious. Question came in around, since you're the collector of things, anything cool from True Grit or any of the movies that were filmed that are kind of relics, I guess, that have been collected that either you have or exist someplace in case anybody's interested in checking those out?
I don't have them yet, but I've got a lady who I didn't know who contacted me from Salem, and her dad, I think it was an extra on the film and has some stuff that he collected during that time period that he was working for the summer on the film that she wants to donate to me. So she's coming over here to go camping in the summer. She's going to bring that stuff to me. So I don't know what it is, but she thought some interesting stuff that I would be happy to get. And I said, yeah, I would. So.
Well, see, the unfortunate, I guess, benefit to all of us is that this becomes a semi-full-time job for you now, because you're just going to be the collector of things, the historical reference. So,
if they have some information or comments or things I have not included in the presentation, I would love to hear those.
Most definitely. No, that'd be great. That would be great. Let's see here. I think some of the interesting things, it's so hard to think about property value and what you're talking about, especially early in the presentation when we were talking about the early 70s. Any other, I guess, interesting ebbs and flows besides what you covered tonight of property value and other things that may have impacted that we're presenting on specifically tonight? So anything else interesting that maybe you uncovered?
Not necessarily that, but I just find it so fascinating that, and it's an issue that I've been interested in, is why we don't have more permanent residents in Sunriver. When marketing director said that by 1992, we'd have 15,000 permanent residents, and we may have 10% of that number right now. So 50 years into the development, we have maybe 1,500 permanent residents, and I find it would be interesting to do some kind of analysis as why that is the case. And we have a lot of the people who are permanent residents came as visitors, and then eventually they ended up buying a home and renting it with the idea that they would retire over here. And I'm seeing more and more. We've got neighbors on both sides of us who are still working, and they're spending more and more time with the pandemic over here, and are looking at retiring over here. And we have one neighbor who just did that, who lived in Portland but could work anywhere, and now are permanent residents here. So I think we're going to see more of that. But I just find it interesting that we've never been able to get to that magic number or anywhere close to it.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm getting some feedback too. Looks like we have a little bit of a Minty issue. We had to reload it. Looks like we had our first little glitch. So everybody that's using Mentimeter, try to restart your app or go ahead and reload that page, put the event code back in, and we should be able to get to some other questions. So here we go. It's working. Here we go. It's working. Okay. You're getting a lot of kudos, everybody. So again, Minty is a great app, everybody. Really appreciate the kudos. We specifically, if you want to throw kudos in the chat, that is fantastic. For Minty, if we can keep it to questions just to kind of help me moderate, that would be great, but really appreciate it. A couple folks did ask questions though. If you missed part of the presentation, yes, it is recorded. This exact same event link for this presentation will show it. It will need to do some post-event processing tonight, but literally within about an hour or so, we should have it ready to go and back up there with some edits. So you will be able to watch all the presentation. And again, John, a couple of folks in here just said a big thank you for presenting tonight. So we'll give it a little bit of a second. Anything else that maybe, so I'm trying to think, there's so many interesting things tonight. There's so much information. I am kind of actually curious about the what did we call it again? It was the Crawfish Olympics thing. Any other like neat references to that? I mean, it's one of those things that I grew up in the Midwest. So, we had like the Covered Bridge festivals, and we had some of these different things that were sort of like keystone events that, like, unless you live there, you may not have known about. Is there anything else that's been kind of interesting in Sunriver's history where maybe we didn't talk about tonight, but things that you might be aware of?
What I don't understand with the crawfish is, are there crawfish in the Deschutes River today? Have the crawfish festival this summer if you wanted to. I don't know anybody who has gone out there and gotten tonight's meal of crawfish out of the Deschutes River, and not only in Sunriver but anywhere along the Deschutes River. Can you go crawfish fishing in Bend? I don't know if you can or not. I'd be curious to know if anybody knows how to catch crawfish in Sunriver.
Yeah, and I don't know either. We're gonna have to talk to some of our river experts, but that would be interesting. Oh, go ahead.
One thing I want to mention is we spent a lot of time talking about the administration building and the fact that it went through like 5 votes before it got approval to build it without an assessment. And the reason I wanted to focus on that is when we do the session on shark, is the interesting aspect of that is we had to go out and get 60% of the owners to be willing to spend $4,000 in 2009, which was the depth of the recession. So we had gone through history and looked at what happened in that time frame when the owners didn't trust the board and wouldn't just go ahead and say, I'll go ahead. And it was like $14 a month assessment for 36 months, and they wouldn't approve it. So the challenge that we had, I was on the team, was how do we convince the owners to do this? And so I wanted to share that background information, and we'll spend more time on it when we talk about shark.
That's great. And I'm looking forward to it. Again, we've got everybody, the 3rd-part series coming up in 2 weeks. Looks like we've got most of our questions. And again, apologize for the Minty issue. We'll make sure we get that fixed up for next week. But definitely appreciate the questions that have come in and the kudos. Again, great job, John. That was great. Part 2 of the history of Sunriver is now in the books. So before we head out this evening, just wanted to give again a very special shout out to both OSU Cascades and Connect Central Oregon for their assistance in the event production for tonight for the series, and then clearly to Sunriver U and the Owner Enrichment Committee for bringing you this program. I think it's something that people are really going to enjoy, and something that now, because of our technology, we can do so for far beyond just tonight. We'll see you back again on the Sunriver YouTube channel. Sunriver U YouTube, I always mess that up. The Sunriver U YouTube channel on Thursday night, April 8th, again at 6 p.m. We'll be back with John. And don't forget that all of these presentations, again, like we mentioned earlier, are available after the live stream. So talk them up, share them with folks. Literally, it's as easy as taking the URL from your browser, emailing it to friends and family to get a little bit of a glimpse and some of the cool history with one of my favorite places in Central Oregon. So everybody, thanks again and have a fantastic night. We'll see you in 2 weeks.